The United Nations General Assembly is considered by many people as being ineffective or weak. This is mainly due to the fact that people sometimes believe that the United Nations General Assembly should be stopping wars, should be enforcing international law. But now, if you base or assess the United Nations General Assembly on this criteria, you miss the whole point of what the United Nations General Assembly was actually designed to do. In this video, we're going to change your mind. We're going to change how you evaluate the United Nations General Assembly. I'm Jay Chronic. This is Decoded HQ. The United Nations General Assembly, or what we're going to be calling UNGA, is one of the most misunderstood organs of the United Nations. As I mentioned in episode 1 of this United Nations series, there are 6 principal organs, and the United Nations General Assembly is one of those 6 principal organs. Now, people see the sheer numbers of, they see the number of members that are in the United Nations General Assembly, and then they assume that because there are so many different members that are in the General Assembly, that this would mean that this particular organ has a lot of power, right? They see that, okay, there are over 190 members. Basically, every single country in the world is within this organ. And then there's this huge misconception of the amount of power that they actually have. Now, the United Nations General Assembly has power, but you need to know what type of power they actually have. And this is when we're actually going to go in depth, and we're going to explain the structure of UNGA so that you now have a different way of evaluating this particular organ. Because if you're evaluating them on their ability to stop wars and enforce international laws, then you're going to be using a very flawed criteria. So in order for us to have a better criteria on how we evaluate the United Nations General Assembly, we're going to need to have a better understanding of the structure of this particular organ. As I mentioned before, there are over 190 members in the United Nations General Assembly, but this is where people need to really listen clearly here. The United Nations General Assembly's aim is just to provide representation. Equal representation on top of that. And some people basically dismiss it and say, oh, listen, they just discuss matters, they just debate matters, but it rarely gets affected. No, on the contrary, my friend. What the United Nations General Assembly is really good at is designing narratives. If something is discussed at the United Nations General Assembly and nations debate and each vote equally, remember, they've got equal representation. So even a country the size of the United States of America has got the equal voting power as a country as small as Jamaica. You see how powerful that is. And what's debated at the United Nations General Assembly, what ends up being resolved, let's say if a conflict happens, they end up creating a narrative around what is perceived as normal behavior. You see, the United Nations General Assembly, they're the ones that set the behavior of what we're going to now deem as irresponsible, reckless, in the international sense. They're the ones that set the standards. I'm going to need to give you a few examples so that I don't lose you here. We've got a prime example of colonization, right? In order for countries to now transition into independence, it was first discussed at the United Nations. Resolution 1714, I'm going to put it up here in case I've gotten the resolution wrong, but it was discussed to say, okay, colonized states must transition into independence. Another good example, we've got, sorry, I've now actually, it was actually 1514. 1514, that's what I'm sticking to. 1514, resolution 1514 was established so that colonized states can transition into independence. Then we have resolution 1761, where it was one of the first resolutions to then condemn apartheid South Africa. They create a narrative to say, okay, the United Nations General Assembly creates a narrative where it's now the apartheid government, their behavior was now considered as being bad, right? So as you can see, once the United Nations discuss and then they perceive that behavior as being bad, then it's easier for other countries to then now issue out sanctions, to then condemn, countries once it's now been discussed at the United Nations General Assembly. So they may not have the ability to now send, you know, send armies and enforce sanctions, but what their power actually has is creating narratives. And once you create a narratives, that is how you and me have a different understanding on how we talk on matters. Once they condemned apartheid South Africa, it was now normal for you now to say something bad about the apartheid South Africa, right? You couldn't defend it. Anyone who was defending apartheid South Africa, once the United Nations General Assembly had discussed that what's happening in South Africa is bad, anyone who would try and defend that would then be deemed as being evil. In conclusion, the United Nations General Assembly is not designed to stop wars or enforce international law. The correct criteria, the correct evaluation system that we should actually have for the United Nations General Assembly is evaluating them on the volume of their voice in times of misjustice. Do they speak up when international law is being violated? That is the correct criteria in order for us to have a correct assessment of the efforts of this particular organ. In the next video, we're going to be looking at the Security Council, the United Nations Security Council, who actually have enforcement power. I hope to see you guys there soon. I'm Jay Chronic. This has been Decoded HQ.